You're watching Promethean Actions Weekly class for November 22nd, 2025, with author Robert Ingram. This is Tony Pappert. I'll be your host. Uh, Tonight's class is the Massachusetts Miracle, the origins of the American system, in significant part in the religious views of the Massachusetts Bay colonists. This is the origins of the American system, which President Trump is reviving today after decades of departure from our original American system. So, with that, um, let me bring on Bob.
Okay, hi everybody. Glad to be back here again. Probably many of you, not all, but many of you who are on this call might have seen the article that I posted on the Promethean Action website, I don't know, several days ago, a week ago, entitled Unleash the American System, the Massachusetts Miracle. And that's what is going to be the subject of this discussion tonight. So for those of you who read the article, this will be somewhat repetitive, but I think the more important than the presentation is the discussion that we get into after I finish speaking. I will say, for those who want to pursue some of these questions a little bit further, there are two books I've written which go into some of this material. I'll hold up one of them. This is entitled A New Birth of Freedom, which is available on Amazon, which goes into the question of the Pilgrims. There's an article in there, a section in there on the Pilgrims that goes into it somewhat in depth. And then also, I won't hold the second book up. One is enough. The biography I wrote of Cotton Mather, of Benjamin Franklin, has a chapter devoted entirely to Cotton Mather, which goes into related material that's directly relevant to what I'm going to be discussing tonight. So those are two resources which you could look into, which will cover what I'm going to talk about tonight, cover it in more depth. Okay, so the first thing to do is to situate why we're having this kind of discussion right now. I made a decision, I don't know, a month or two ago, to write a series of articles. I'm not sure how many there are going to be. I will tell you that the next one is going to be on Benjamin Franklin, but a series of articles under the overall title of Unleash the American System. And the idea behind these is to sort of inject into this current political discussion this question of the history of the American Republic as a nation, as a culture, which from the very beginning has been committed to scientific, technological, manufacturing progress, upward human progress, from the very inception of our nation, even before we were independent. That this, in a certain way, is embedded in our culture. It's not mentioned in the way that, certainly not the way I'm going to talk about it. It's not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, but nevertheless, it's sort of an unwritten principle that has been part of our culture and part of our nation from its very founding. And today, of course, we see the brilliant efforts by Donald Trump, President Trump, to restore this heritage, to rebuild American manufacturing, to once again have America become a leader in advanced science and technology, and in the process of doing that, to create millions upon millions of productive jobs, jobs which will uplift the standard of living, the opportunities, the hope for the American people. That this is at the heart of what Trump is fighting to accomplish. Uh, you know, in a certain way, this is really the heart and soul of making America great again. Now, the what I have been attempting to do with this class series and these series of articles is to make it as clear as I can that what Trump is doing today is heroic, but it is not new. That this impulse uh, uh, has been there from the very beginning. Um, the commitment to the development of a productive economy, a productive future um, for all of the, all of our people. That this was there from the beginning. It was the fight then. It's the fight today, uh, and you and it's not just about this industry or that industry, all of which is important. You know, the efforts today to, for example, just one example, revive the nuclear power industry, all of this is critically important. But fundamentally, it comes down to the people. And I don't know how many of you, I'm not going to talk about it unless it comes up in the question and answer period, but I don't know how many of you watch the entirety. If you haven't watched the entirety, I would encourage you to do so. But I don't know how many of you watched the entirety of President Trump's uh, public meeting in the Oval Office with Mamdani, the new mayor of New York. Uh, but it was very revealing, because what was very clear there is that Trump is not interested in being manipulated by the news media. He's not interested in political labels or political slogans. That his commitment is to the people of New York, the people of New York, and to make their lives better. And that really has been the fight uh, in America from its very founding. So I'm going to begin with Tony talked about the religious question, because I am of the view that you cannot separate out religion from from this creative economic impulse. That to say, well, one is religious and one is secular and economic, I think that is really a very erroneous way to approach this, because the drive to create a productive, scientifically and technologically advanced culture and economy in the American colonies, going all the way back to 1620, that this is very much tied in with a certain view of what it means to be human, of what the human identity actually is. Uh, it's not; these are not separate things. Uh, uh, the Pilgrims who came over in 1620, people say they were fleeing from religious persecution, but it really was more than that. And actually, they weren't being that badly persecuted in Holland, where they had been for almost 10 years. They had been persecuted in England, not so much in Holland, although it was getting worse in Holland. The But they didn't come here to just escape from persecution. I'm not saying that was not part of it, but they came here to create something new. They came here to create a new type of society, one which was not possible in Europe because of the control in Europe by the monarchies, the oligarchical cultures, the what were then developing into the British and the Dutch empires. Uh, uh, that the concept, and you see this very much in John Winthrop in his notion of creating a city upon the hill in Boston, that the concept, the intention, the determination, the fight was to create a new type of society in the new world, one in which human beings could be free, could exercise uh, uh, their creative capabilities, free to live, free to invent, free to discover, free to make progress, free to build up productive societies, free to have education for their children, productive human societies. Now, I want to take this back to someone who I've talked about a lot. Almost no one else ever talks about him, but I think he's a seminal figure, which was the religious leader of the what became what we call today the Pilgrim denomination. They didn't call themselves Pilgrims, but we know them today as Pilgrims. The people who came over in 1620. The religious leader of the what we would call the Pilgrim Church. The religious leader was a man named John Robinson, and he headed that church for a long time. And he gave many sermons, and he wrote other essays in which he expounded upon what what their church was about and what they believed in, and what their view of the human condition was, what it meant to be human, and what the relationship is between a human being and God. And I'm just going to give you two short quotes from one of the sermons he gave. This is a sermon entitled Of Faith, Hope, and Love, Reason, and Sense. And in that sermon, he said, and this is a direct quote, reason is that wherein man goes before all other earthly creatures and comes after God only. Uh, okay. No, don't put any slides up yet. Oh, you're putting that slide up. Yeah, that is true. Thank you, Tony. Uh, I'm a little confused. So people can read along. Reason is that wherein man goes before all other earthly creatures and comes after God only. For whereas God and nature hath furnished other creatures, some with hoofs, others with other instruments and weapons, both defensive and offensive, man is left naked and destitute of all these, but may comfort himself in that one endowment of reason and providence, whereby he is able to govern them all. Okay? Now, I'm not going to try to interpret that for you, but I think if you read it, it's up there on the screen, read it carefully. He is positing a notion of the human identity absolutely separate and superior to all other animals, all other creatures, based on the endowment by God of the power of creative reason, which has been given to mankind. And then the second quote, which you can put up, Tony, this is from the same sermon. To love God is to become godly, and to have the mind, after a sort, deified, being made partakers of the divine nature. He that loves not his brother whom he sees, how can he love God whom he sees not? And so natural to Christians is this brotherly love, as that the apostle makes account he need not write to the churches to teach them that which God taught them so many ways. To love as we ought is a very happy thing wherein we resemble God. That is, this is what some people call agape. To me, it doesn't really matter what word you use, but this idea of Christian love, um, um, which involves a love of God and a love of our fellow human beings, that by making this part of you, by making this part of your soul, of your identity, of that which motivates you day to day, by doing this, you are, after a sort, deified, being made partakers of the divine nature, and that this is wherein we resemble God. So you take these two things together, of these two different, excerpts I took from the sermon, one on creative reason and one on Christian love. You put them together, and it is very useful and I think very important to think through that it is ideas precisely like these quotations I just read to you, which were at the heart and soul of those who came over to North America in 1620, to those who founded the Plymouth colony. And I have actually found very few people who, some, but I found very few people who have really thought this through, who have really thought through the implications of, if you take these words from John Robinson, if you take them seriously, if you realize that this was really at the heart of the Pilgrim mission, what this means. What this means for what the United States became, what the American Republic became, and the idea of this notion of what it means to be human, which you have to recognize was completely at odds with oligarchical culture that was then suffocating Europe, that was leading Europe at that time into the 30 Years' War, religious warfare. Here we have a completely different idea. And they come to America and they say, we're going to build a new society based on these principles. And it's also, as I mentioned in the article, very useful to know that if you look at these other European colonies, because the Pilgrim colony was certainly not the first European colony. You had the Spanish, who had been here for a long time, the Portuguese, in Mexico and Spanish, Mexico and with the Portuguese in South America and elsewhere, the Spanish, Mexico and elsewhere. You had the French, who were all over North America. You had all of these European colonies. And almost all of them, for a long, long time, later it changed, but for a long time, almost all of these colonies were made up of men, no women, very, very, very few women. No, these were not colonies to create a new society. These were people who were sent over by, the British East India Company, and and well, not the British East, but the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Spanish Empire, and they were sent over to extract loot, gold, silver, whatever else they could lay their hands on, and send it back to Madrid, send it back to Paris, send it back to Lisbon, send it back to, to London, extract loot and send the loot back. But you look at uh, um, the um, the Plymouth colony, and when the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth, there were 102 passengers on the Mayflower, 102. 48 of them, a minority, were men. 24 of them were women, and 30 of them were children. In other words, what came over on the Mayflower and then the later ships which arrived, and very much so when the Puritans came to Boston in 1630, were not, men out to make a buck or to transfer money back to England or elsewhere. What came over on these ships were families with the idea of building a future for future generations, for people yet unborn, a productive future. So let's get to that productive future. In 1630, the Puritans came to Boston. Now, they're a little different than the Pilgrims, although they were very friendly with them. There was no conflict between them, very friendly. But they're a little bit different in terms of their religious views. But the Puritans came over in 1630. Now, unlike the Pilgrims, who had very little in the way of money and who, to a certain extent, were what you might call refugees, the Puritan expedition was much better financed, and they managed to secure their own charter, which the Pilgrims did not have. But the Puritans managed to secure their own charter, and they came over with 10 boats, 10 ships in 1630 with 800 passengers. So this was a big colonization. 800 passengers, again, families, men, women, and children, and in 10 ships. And they very rapidly established their colony in Boston and in the areas immediately surrounding Boston. That was 1630. Now, I'm not going to say anything really much more about the Puritans because that's not the subject of this discussion. But 12 years after the establishment of Boston, so, you got to imagine the first few years, I mean, they're building houses, they're doing this, they're doing that. They've got to get everything set up. They got to be able to survive and what have you. So that obviously is a big consideration. But only 12 years after they landed in Boston, the leader of the colony was John Winthrop. But in 1642, his son, John Winthrop Jr., who's usually called John Winthrop the Younger, in 1642, he established an ironworks outside of Boston. Now, you have to really sort of grasp the audacity of this, the hubris of it, because in 1630, the entire area is wilderness, with some scattered Indian tribes and some others, but basically wilderness. And in 1642, he decides he's going to establish an iron industry. And they build this iron industry. They create a company called the Company of Undertakers for the Iron Works in New England. And yeah, you could put up that picture of John Winthrop the Younger. We'll just show it. We don't have to keep it up. It was number one, I think. I did them out of order. I changed the order of how I was going to present this. Go back. Can you go back? Yeah, slide one, I think. Yeah. This is John Winthrop the Younger. Okay, just so you have a picture of him, you know what he looks like. And he's the one who established the Saugus Iron Works. Or you could take that down. We don't need to look at his picture. Is the so they established this company to build an iron industry, and the in 1647, the ironworks were relocated to a better site. The original site proved not to be the best place, so they relocated it to a second site, and this is the famous Saugus Ironworks. And you might as well put a picture of that up, Tony. We won't leave it up for very long, but I think that's slide 2. Yeah. Now, this is not the original building. You know, the original building fell into disrepair, and I think it actually almost vanished, collapsed. But they rebuilt it, yeah, at some point. And this is only part of it. There's a whole series of buildings, all of which are part of the ironworks. You can see that it's paddled by water power, with the paddle there. And this is just one of the buildings, which you can visit today. They have a whole national historical monument there, and you could take tours of it, what have you, if you want to go up to Saugus, Massachusetts. But this, as I said, in 1647, the Saugus Ironworks was established. You could take that down, Tony. Now, within 1 year of establishing the Saugus Ironworks, within 1 year, they were producing 1 ton of iron per day, a ton per day, 365 tons of iron a year. And the works consisted, as I said, of an array of buildings, numerous buildings, including a blast furnace for producing pig iron and gray iron, a forge where this iron was refined into wrought iron. They had a 1/4-ton hammer that was used to make iron bars, which was then sold to blacksmiths for manufacture into finished products. And they had a rolling and slitting mill. Now, I don't know much about iron production, so I'm not really sure what a rolling and slitting mill is, but from my reading, it clearly was extremely important. And out of the rolling and slitting mill, they could produce on the spot as part of the ironworks. They could manufacture nails, bolts, horseshoes, wagon wheels, axes, saw blades, and many, numerous instruments that were required for production, for construction, for transportation, for all kinds of things. And they could they were producing this all for themselves. And by the early 1650s, the Saugus Ironworks was one of the most technologically advanced ironworks in the world. I mean, it wasn't some backwoods sort of primitive thing. It rivaled in its technological, advancement, the best iron mills that existed in England or any other part of Europe. I mean, it's really just astounding what they did. And in 1655, Winthrop the Younger set up a second ironworks. This one was in New Haven, Connecticut. He eventually moved to Connecticut. He became the governor of Connecticut, actually. And by 1700, there were 8 iron mills, iron making plants, with, all of which were very advanced. By 1700, there were 8 iron mills in the colonies, mostly in Massachusetts, in the original Plymouth colony, in Connecticut, in Rhode Island, and there was one in New Jersey. One of the things to note is that all of these iron mills that were created in these other locations, that the people who built them and who ran them all began in the Saugus Ironworks. So in other words, the Saugus Ironworks not only was producing a ton of iron a day, but they were training a very highly skilled workforce. And many of the sort of graduates of the Saugus Iron Works were the ones who then went on to establish these ironworks in these other locations, such that by 1700, with 8 ironworks in these various colonies, the American colonies were producing for themselves most of what they needed in terms of finished iron projects, tools, implements, needed in agriculture, needed in transportation, needed in all kinds of things, needed in construction. Can't build houses without nails or hammers or saws, and they could produce all of that for themselves. Um, so this is what they established. Now, I'm not going to go any more through the iron industry because I want to make another point, which is that, and this also relates to what I began with, which is this question of the creative human identity that Robinson talks about, which is that in addition to all of this productive economic activity, a number of these founding fathers were among the leading scientists and scientific thinkers of the day, not just in the colonies, but including in Europe. Winthrop the Younger, who had built the Saugus Iron Works, had a long history as an inventor, as a scientist. He studied chemistry, medicine. He wrote papers on a wide variety of subjects, which I won't go into. But to give you one example, he wrote a paper that he submitted to the Royal Society in London, where he hypothesized, excuse me, he hypothesized the existence of a fifth moon of Jupiter. He was an astronomer. He actually built his own telescope, which he later donated to Harvard University. And he hypothesized the existence of a fifth moon of Jupiter. This is in the 17th century. And the fifth moon of Jupiter was not officially discovered until 1892. So we're talking about almost 200 years before that. He was a leading scientist. He was made a member of the Royal Society. He studied the works of Johannes Kepler, intensely read them. He carried out, at one point in his life, I think this is when he was in Connecticut, he carried out a correspondence with Gottfried Leibniz, who was very young at that time. Winthrop was older, but he carried out a correspondence with Leibniz, and he was a leading scientist. Now, one of Winthrop's allies was a man named Richard Mather, who was a Congregationalist minister, and Winthrop and Mather were very close friends and allies. And Richard Mather had a son who he named Increase Mather, who you may have heard of. And Increase, Richard Mather was the collaborator of John Winthrop Sr., if I didn't make that clear, John Winthrop Sr. But then Richard Mather's son, Increase, became a very close friend and a very close collaborator of Winthrop the Younger. So Increase Mather and Winthrop the Younger. And Increase as well had taken on a in-depth study of the works of Kepler. And Increase Mather himself wrote a number of books on astronomy. One of them was entitled A Discourse Concerning Comets, and then he wrote several others. And in 1680, Increase Mather founded the Boston Philosophical Society as a means for gathering together individuals to discuss the most advanced scientific ideas of the day. And if you look at the American Philosophical Society, which was founded many years later, by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia, it bears a striking resemblance to Increase Mather's Boston Philosophical Society. And if you look at Increase Mather's writings, he was, again, very religious. But if you look at his writings on science, and I've read a couple of them, what he's doing is he's attempting to demonstrate a coherence between scientific thought and religious belief, that these are not contrary. It's not that you have superstitious or mysterious religion, and then you have, mathematical science, logical science. Increase Mather says, no, these things are the same. There is a coherence between them. And he delivered a sermon. Increase Mather was also a minister. He delivered a sermon entitled, "The Light of Reason is the Work of God. The Law of Reason is the law of God. The voice of reason is the voice of God." And I actually read that sermon. You can get it, online. And he's what he's asserting, what he's working through, is this concept that the creative human identity, that part of us which is able to make scientific discoveries, that this is the voice of God. This is a power given to us through which we can unravel the physical and other mysteries of the universe. Now, and I will say that Increase's son, Cotton Mather, who is more famous, also became a leading scientist. And I'm not going to try to go into Cotton Mather in depth by any stretch of the imagination here. But if you look at, Cotton Mather wrote many, many works. But if you look at his last two major works, they're both scientific works. One is called The Angel of Bethesda, and the other is called The Christian Philosopher. And The Angel of Bethesda is a work on medicine, and it comes directly out of Cotton Mather's successful efforts to develop a smallpox inoculation in Boston to deal with the smallpox epidemic. And The Christian Philosopher is a work on botany. And again, in that work, what he is examining is the divine principles, the principles which underlie the scientific laws which govern living processes. And it's a very interesting work. So I just go through some of this to give you the idea that manufacturing, industry, technology, as well as the pursuit of the most advanced scientific ideas and principles, were there from the beginning, long before the American Revolution. That this is what was going on, in Massachusetts and elsewhere, and not just in Boston, but spreading to many other locations. Now, what I want to go into here now is the question of money and credit, and I'll cut it a little short. But one of the biggest obstacles they ran into in terms of the economic development of, I'm sort of sticking to Massachusetts here because that's similar things were going on elsewhere, but I'm going to focus on Massachusetts. In terms of the economic development of the colony, one of the biggest problems they ran into was the shortage of money, or you could put it another way, the lack of credit for development, for investment in productive enterprises. There were no banks in the colonies. There were no legal monetary authorities, and they were dependent entirely on circulating coins, not just English coins, because there were a lot of other coins circulating, but Spanish coins, English coins, Dutch coins, all of which were minted in Europe. They were entirely dependent on these circulating coins coming from Europe, and these coins in Massachusetts were in very, very short supply, and you had to a very large extent at various times an economy which was really based on barter more than anything else, because there simply were not enough coins to go around. So what happened was that in 1652, um, the uh, um, the Massachusetts government decided to create its own mint. This, the Massachusetts Bay Colony created a mint of its own without permission from London, and they began minting their own coins, which they called the Pine Tree Shilling. And we can put that up. You can pass up the Christian philosopher. This is number 7, I think, Tony. Just keep going. Yeah, I think it's
Oh,
no. Go to just go to the next one. Yeah. So this is a picture of a pine tree shilling. You can see it's got a pine tree on it, and you could see the date that it's minted, 1652. I'm not sure what all the writing says. Something about New England, Massachusetts. Yeah, New England, Massachusetts. Um, and anyway, so you could take that down, but that's the pine tree shilling, which they began minting in 1652. And these were minted, and this then alleviated the problem of the shortage of money for about 3 decades. They circulated, and it had a very beneficial effect. Um, but this all came to an end. In 1684, the British King Charles II revoked the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, because as I stated at the beginning, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was sort of unique among the colonies, and that it had its own independent charter. See, this is sort of a little anecdote, but it's sort of funny. What happened, at least in order to have a colony, you had to have a charter signed by the king. And the nature of these charters varied from colony to colony. But the charter that the king signed, the piece of paper the king signed, was supposed to stay in London in some kind of royal or government vault, because basically the charter was from the government, it was signed by the king, and they were the legal owners of the colony. But what happened was when John Winthrop Sr. got a charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he took the charter with him to Boston. And this had a long sort of funny history to it, because there were all these requests that came up every several years or so, where people in London would write to Boston and say, you got to send this charter back to us. You don't have the right to have it. You got to send it back to us. And of course, the Boston people, Winthrop and these other guys, they would never do that. They held on to it. But what happened in 1684 is that King Charles revoked the charter completely, revoked it. And he made Massachusetts a royal colony with a royally appointed governor, which they had not had up to that point. And in the act revoking the charter, it was also said or stated or declared that the colony would no longer have the power to print its own money, that the mint that they had established was abolished, that the pine tree shilling was abolished, and that the government of Massachusetts was forbidden to take other actions to support the development of manufacturing, mining, or other, productive activity. They could not give subsidies. They could not give tax breaks. They could do nothing to, subsidize productive economic development. Increase Mather led the fight against this. He wrote a work called New England Vindicated from Unjust Aspersions, where he argued that the power for Massachusetts to print its or to create its own money, to emit its own money, was vital to the development of the colony. But of course, he lost that fight, and the pine tree shilling was history, and that was that. Um, the the Several years later, uh, Cotton Mather intervened, and he wrote a work called Some Considerations on Bills of Credit, which is an argument in favor of emitting a paper currency. The pine tree shilling was not paper; these were coins. But Cotton Mather wrote this work for the emitting of a paper currency, and I want to read you some excerpts from it. I know we're running up on the hour here, but I want people to get this. So can you put this up, Tony?
Yeah. It's not very clear, but
Number
it's
9.
just, yeah.
Is it readable?
With difficulty, but so you'll read it and people could read it.
All right. Next one.
This is it.
That's as large as it goes.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Well,
It's
people,
long.
I don't know, people. If you can read that, more power to you. But I'll read the excerpt from it. This is in Cotton Mather, 1691. I cannot a little wonder at the great indiscretion of our countrymen who refuse to accept that which they call paper money as pay of equal value to the best Spanish silver. What? Is the word paper a scandal to them? Is it not as valuable as so much silver or gold, supposing the security of payment be sufficient? Now, what is the security of your paper money less than the credit of the whole country? If the country's debts must be paid, as I believe they must, and I am sure in justice they will be paid, whatever change of government shall come, then the country must make good the credit, or more taxes must be raised till the public debts be answered. I say the country, not the gentlemen who administer the government, who are but the country's agents in this affair. All the inhabitants of the land, taken as one body, are the principals who reap the benefits and must bear the burdens. Sir, you and I have had some former discourse about the nature of money, that it is but a counter or measure of men's properties, an instituted mean of permutation. As metal, indeed, it is a commodity, like all other things that are merchantable. But as money, it was no more than what was said. Do not bills transmit to remote parts vast sums without the intervention of silver? Are not taxes paid and received by mutual credit between the government and the people, the government requiring the country to give them credit to pay the country's debts, and then again receive the same credit of the country as good pay? 'Tis strange that in the meanwhile, between the government paying the people and the people paying the government's, or rather the country's bills, should not pass between man and man. Upon the difficulties and necessity which the country hath been brought into, a better way could not well be thought upon than the credit now passing among us. Silver we have not enough in this country to do which must be done, more being usually exported than is imported. What is the use of coined silver but to furnish a man with credit that he may obtain from his neighbors those commodity which he hath occasion for? Now, I don't know if you could follow all that, but this is an argument, and as far as I know, the first in-depth argument published in America on this concept of public credit. And it may be a little bit different, it may be a little bit more primitive, but in my mind, it is very coherent with Alexander Hamilton's notion of public credit. And I could tell you that some years later, Benjamin Franklin wrote extensively on the issue of paper money and public credit in Philadelphia. And his arguments are very similar and very coherent with what Cotton Mather lays out here. Public credit for, for development, for development, for industry, for agriculture, for transportation, for the upward development of society, this notion of public credit. So the last thing I want to go into, and then we'll stop, is what the British Empire did about this impulse in the American colonies, this impulse for human creativity, for upward progress, for economic development, for manufacturing, for technology. Well, they did everything they could to stop it. I mean, the shutting down of the Massachusetts Mint, of the pine tree shilling, is just part of it. But they took a lot of other steps. They began outlawing manufacturing in the colonies. And there's a history to this. It went on over decades, preventing the colonies from developing economically. And the one that I really want to talk about was the Iron Act of 1750. So this is 26 years before the Declaration of Independence, when the Iron Act was passed in Parliament in London, signed into law. And this act prohibited iron production in the colonies. Remember, we had 8 advanced iron mills in 1700. I don't know how many we had in 1750, but we had a flourishing iron industry in 1750. Benjamin Franklin's patron and ally and friend, James Logan, was a major iron manufacturer in Pennsylvania. And it was out of the Pennsylvania iron mills that Franklin's stove was manufactured and put up for sale. And in 1750, the Iron Act was passed prohibiting iron manufacture in the colonies, and prohibiting the building of steelmaking furnaces, iron mills, forges, and other facilities to make finished iron products. And we were not only prohibited from exporting these things, but we were prohibited from making these things for ourselves in the colonies. And I'll give you one other, might seem like a ludicrous example, but they passed an act to prohibit the manufacture of hats in the colonies. Hats, to prohibit it. That all hats of any kind that people wore had to be imported from England. I'm serious about this. They did this. Despite the fact that we could easily produce all the hats we needed to produce in the colonies. So we not only were prohibited from producing hats and selling them in Europe, we were prohibited from making hats and selling them within the colonies. And there's a long list, a laundry list of things, which by the 1750s, 1760s, we were prohibited to make in the colonies. And now I'll just close with trying to give people a sense of what was really going on here. Was it just about iron Was it just about hats or some other such thing? Um, well, in 1660, a company was formed in London called the Royal Africa Company. And the actual head of this company was the future King James II. He was not the king then. He was like the Duke of York or something like that. But he was the future King James II. So he's first in line to the British throne. And he was the head of the Royal Africa Company. So this goes right up to the monarchy and you could put that up, that Royal Africa. You just go, yeah, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, this is the emblem, the insignia of the Royal Africa Company. This is their official insignia. You can see it doesn't look too good, right? Okay, you can take that down. Um, so this goes right up to the British throne, to the Privy Council, to the highest levels of the City of London. And the Royal Africa Company was founded basically to become the vehicle for the massive, massive importation of slaves into the American colonies. See, up until 1660, the amount of slaves in the colonies, even in the South, was fairly small, fairly modest. Um, but what the British had done, and in this they sort of took the same model as the Spanish and the French and the Portuguese. What the British had done in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, is they had developed these massive slave plantations, massive, mostly for sugar, right? For sugar production. Not entirely, but mostly. Where you had, in some of these places, the slaves made up 80 to 90% of the population of some of these islands in the Caribbean. Massive plantations where they worked the slaves to death. I think the lifespan of the slaves was about 5 years because they just worked them to death. And they kept just bringing more and more slaves to work these plantations in places like Jamaica, Barbados, places like that. And what the Royal Africa Company was determined to do was to bring this Caribbean slave labor model into the American colonies, into the 13 colonies, to import that model and impose it on the 13 colonies. And between 1672 and 1689, in a period of 17 years, they brought 100,000 slaves into the 13 colonies. This was not an American policy. This was not something the colonies asked for. This was imposed on the colonies by the Royal Africa Company. And the fact is, I said 100,000 slaves between 1672 and 1689, which they did, 100,000. But it didn't stop there. When you get to 1690, 1700, 1710, 1720, 1730, this mass importation of slaves not only continued, but it escalated. It escalated. And the British, the Royal African Society brought hundreds and hundreds of thousands of slaves into the colonies. So what were they doing? They were bringing in hundreds of thousands of slaves. They were shutting down all manufacturing, all advanced science and technology, and they were imposing, the idea was to impose a slave labor economic model on America. So that rather than going back to the original intention, which we see in John Robinson, or we see in someone like John Winthrop the Younger with the creation of the Saugus Iron Works, with colonies of families, of a new society based on science, industry, freedom, and upward human development. What the British were doing by the early 18th century was imposing on the colonies a model of no manufacturing, no industry, massive slave labor, low wages, and revoking all political independence or semi-independence in the colonies. You know, and if you think about it, this is exactly what the British did later in India and in all of their other colonies. The imperial model. So the American Revolution was not a tax revolt by any stretch of the imagination. The taxes were just one oppressive part of this. Because what the British were determined to do was to eradicate the original intention of the settlers who came to our shore in the 17th century to create a new type of human society, an anti-oligarchical type of society. So I will end there, Tony.